welcome everyone. We're going to be talking today a bit about biblical studies from a process perspective. And one of the things that I hear frequently and that I'd like to respond to just a little bit, people say, well, progressives don't really care about the Bible. And I think that probably includes process theologians, which is not my experience. Thus, we're talking to you. In your book, and for those who want to look it up, I'll refer them to page 3 of the book. You talk about reopening public discourse about the Bible. In particular, what do you mean by public discourse, and why should we value that?
Good question. The distinction I'm trying to make there is between public discourse and private discourse. All too often, at least today, the Bible has been shunted off to just the interest of only the churches, people who are not involved in the church or who are involved in an issue which isn't traditionally thought of as a church issue. Then they don't even consider what the Bible might have to say. An illustration I sometimes use to show that is I've recently begun to study classical guitar. And when I entered the world of classical guitar and joined some societies and things such as this, we have a common lingo that we use, and the terms that we use, we understand what we're talking about, and we make some basic assumptions about the whole of our discussion. In many ways, that's how the Bible's been treated. Just like today, within the circle of classical guitar people, if I start talking about the bridge and the fretboard and the machine head and the nut and the saddle, people within that world know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't have to elaborate and go into extensive detail. In many ways, that's the way the Bible is being treated now. It's the literature of a particular group of people, increasingly a smaller group of people today, and therefore the Bible is getting relegated to this private discussion. It's okay for them to talk about it, but it's not okay for the larger group of people, the public, to discuss it. And what I would like to see is if we can begin to understand language differently, the Bible can become part of the public discourse, so that when we're having conversations that don't, on the surface, look like church conversations, the Bible still may have something valuable to say about that could help shape what's happening out there in the public world, not just the church world.
Okay, would you see that also as a barrier between various church traditions, especially, say, between Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, but also, for example, between various Protestant denominations?
Yes, I think so. In addition to there really being 3 different Christian Bibles, I mean, the books that compose what's considered scripture for those 3 groups, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant, there are also within just those groups different ways of talking about the Bible that are unique to that particular group. And that's why I become very concerned about stepping back a bit and not so much before we examine the Bible, but look at the concept of language and perception. Because if we start with common presuppositions about language and presuppositions, then we can break down these barriers that individual groups have created, whether it be within even different Protestant groups, how they will talk about the Bible differently, and they'll assume different things about the Bible, or if it's a larger thing like Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. So what I would say is so much of what passes for discussion today is people talking past one another. They don't really have a true conversation because they're beginning with different presuppositions which set them on courses so that they go past one another. So what I always suggest to students is take a step or 2 back. Look at the broader picture. What assumptions are you making that I'm not making? Can we come together and agree upon some assumptions, and therefore we can talk to one another, not past one another? So that's how one of the reasons I got involved in the field of hermeneutics, or the study of how we create meaning out of all the data that bombards us constantly. I'm particularly interested in text, obviously, being a New Testament person. But text can be oral as well as written, and they can be visual as well as, oral or written. So there are different forms of text, but we are constantly being bombarded by data through our senses, which we then organize into certain patterns that become meaningful to us. And so that's what I'm mostly concerned about, is how do people create meaning out of that which they're perceiving?
In essence, without a common basis and common hermeneutic, or at least some commonality in your hermeneutic, you're going to have a hard time discussing anything else.
Yes, I think so. And the Bible is a prime example of that. There are certain assumptions that different groups make about the Bible, how it's to be read, that are quite different from other groups. And so they either can't communicate at all, or they just talk past one another, or unfortunately, more often get into arguments. And that doesn't contribute to anything.
The arguments never end as long as the hermeneutic has not been addressed.
Exactly.
I want to take just a slight excursus, because we're going to be talking about this business of language and linguistics, which interests me a great deal, and I think should interest anyone who's studying a text. But if you could encapsulate, when you deal with process theology in the Bible, define what you mean there.
Yeah, that's a question I get often, and I never know how in depth to go. What I have done over time has moved away from using any of the technical language, because to back up a bit, it comes from the thinking primarily of a man named Alfred North Whitehead, and he was a remarkable man. He made his first mark on society as a logician and mathematician, and wrote at that time with Bertrand Russell the preeminent work on logic and mathematics. And then he moved from there into what most people would refer to as more of a metaphysical direction. And so he focused primarily on philosophy, which of course logic is a subset of. So he's a philosopher who tried to come to terms with a description of reality that he felt was more adequate than what most philosophers had attempted so far, and certainly as what most people just perceive reality of being. So getting into it from that perspective, and then showing how it comes to the notion of hermeneutics, Whitehead felt that at its bedrock level, reality is not being, but becoming. So that's a major shift philosophically right there. Instead of being, it's becoming. That is, he felt that reality is not composed of little bitty bits of, the philosophical word is substances, that are unchanging and endure through time. Like little building blocks that the way this came into the Western way of thinking is through the Greek concept of the atom. So if you can think of everything being composed of little atoms, and they just, by the time they accumulate so much, we see what appears to us to be enduring things through time. He said that's really a misnomer, that what life is composed of a series of interrelated momentary events. So the difference would be between something that is static and unchanging through time and a series of momentary, I'll use the word energy events, because that seems to communicate today. So it's just a very different way of thinking. Is the most basic aspect of reality change, or is it permanence? That was a question that the Greeks wrestled with. And what dominated the Western world after that was permanence. And Whitehead is saying we should go back and re-examine that question and go down the change route. Like you can't stick your foot in the same river twice. So there were people in the ancient world among the Greeks who were arguing over that. And in the West, permanence won out over change. So he's coming back to change. This has a tremendous implication for all sorts of fields of study, including theology. If everything at its root level is static and unchanging, then you get a picture of a God that is static and unchanging. And so you come up with all kinds of nice theological terms like unmutable. God doesn't change. Well, the theologians took that to its logical conclusion. Now, most Christians don't go this far with it. They get uncomfortable. But they would say, then, therefore, God is apathetic. The alpha privative in Greek at the beginning of a word. Pathetic, pathos, feeling. So it basically says God is unfeeling. Because if God feels the world, then God is not changeless. God is affected by the world. Well, Whitehead said that's exactly the case. God is affected by the world. God experiences all of our pains and suffering and also all of our joys and delights. So for Whitehead, God's power is not one directional. God affecting the world only, and then the creaturely world not having any impact or effect upon God. Whitehead said that's wrong. Whitehead said God affects every element of the world, and the world then affects God. So God is not apathetic. God is very feeling. God experiences all that we do. This then means that God's form of power is not omnipotence, which became one of the big theological terms. That describes God's power as one directional, unilateral, and as coercive or brute force. Rather, what Whitehead said is God does affect every aspect of the world, but not coercively. God doesn't control. God is not an all-controlling entity. Instead, Whitehead would use words such as persuade. God knows what the highest aim is for the next moment of that entity's existence and seeks to persuade it in a particular direction. Or the other term that he used, and this is the one that I pick up on a lot in hermeneutics, lure. Now, I know lure can have a negative connotation because sometimes we think, oh, that's luring me in the wrong direction. But the idea of luring is that it's a persuasive thing. It has a directionality to it. It's trying to lure us in a particular direction. But from God, it's a positive lure, not a negative lure. Or what I've come to use more and more often, since lure does have a negative connotation as well as a positive, I like the word woo, W-O-O. That is a word that is a love word. And that really describes God to a T. God is love. So if God is attempting to woo us in certain directions, the loving word, then we escape that notion of a lure maybe being negative rather than positive. So I've started using the word woo a lot, although lure is more of a technical term coming out of process theology. So God, rather than being all-powerful in the sense of controlling and one-directional in the way God affects things, God is persuasive or luring in power, and God's is affected by the world so that it is relational. So process thought pictures a relational world in which everything affects everything else. And now all of a sudden it's starting to sound scientific because as science has progressed over the years and moved into string theory and quantum mechanics and all the other new types of physics, we see that everything does affect everything. And the next step we'd want to take is that this reality that God is wooing forward, it is somewhat, well, to use it on the human level, there's free will or self-actualization. There are a lot of Christian people who have felt that all the way along, that God's power does not control people, that there is free will. So the predestination versus free will debates, that's gone on a long time in Christianity. So this is not totally new. There have been other people who have talked about humans having free will. What Whitehead says is what's true of humans is true of all of reality. So in other words, all the way down to the subatomic level, there is a sense of free will, but free will sounds kind of odd when you're thinking of, down on this level. So scientists use the term indeterminacy. There is an indeterminacy even at this subatomic level. Predictions are not always accurate. There's this element of indeterminacy. Things can surprise. So if there is this level of indeterminacy, it means that this self-actualization that humans talk about is to some extent characteristic of all of reality. So as the universe is evolving, is changing, God seeks to lure it in certain ways, but because God doesn't control, but rather persuades, it's possible for the creaturely world to reject that approach and choose a different approach. And then that explains how we can have evil in a world of a loving and good God, because God is tempting to woo things forward, but this self-determination or indeterminacy. Another thing that it helps us see is that, to use some terms that are often used in philosophy and religious studies, the world is in God and God is in the world, but it's not in the pantheistic sense where all is God and God is all. Rather, it's in the term panentheism. And this means that God contains the world, but God is more than the world. And the world has God dwelling within it, but the world is not God. It's separate. And another thing that that this usually takes us down the path of is then, if this is the way reality is, and for Whitehead, his magnum opus is called Process and Reality. If this process notion is what reality is, then how should we view something like language? And that's where I got involved with it when I began studying process theology and began to think in terms of what implications does that have for human perceptions. And for me, particularly, I was concerned about language because I deal with a written text so much. So this then changed the way I began to view language. So understanding the world differently from the substance thinking, the permanence change, understanding to change, it dawned on me this would have tremendous implications for how we understand language. And to put that in a quick nutshell, and what I'm getting ready to say now, I think any English teacher would say, yes, that's true. Over time, we have become to think of language as a description of things, almost a one-to-one thing. We understand the language as a symbol, but we have come to understand it as a stenosymbol, to use Philip Wheelwright's term. That is, that there's a one-to-one relationship between the symbol and what it refers to. You see this especially at work in scientific literature. We try to be very precise. But the trouble with language is it doesn't have a one-to-one relationship between the symbol and what it refers to. Now, poets have always known this. They've always known that a symbol, a word, has a one-to-many. So that really, language can function anywhere along the spectrum where at one hypothetical end, you would have a one-to-one relationship. And at the other hypothetical end, you'd have a one-to-everything relationship. Well, if you use those two ends as hypothetical, language operates along a spectrum. And some language really strives to get to as close to a one-to-one relationship as you can. For example, read any scientific journal article, and it begins basically with a defining of the terms and a narrowing of the scope, so that whatever language you're using, you're trying to make it as precise as possible so there's no misunderstanding. In other words, what the author is trying to say is exactly what the reader is supposed to hear. Unfortunately, that doesn't work that way, because take a common scientific symbol, the Greek letter P, or some pronounce it pi. What does that refer to? Well, when I ask students, they say, oh, I know, it's 3.14, and then those who really show off can rattle it off for another 10 or 12 digits. You know, that's what pi refers to, 3.14, that relationship between the circumference of the circle, the radius, the whole bit. And then I look around the class and I see somebody wearing a fraternity or sorority sweatshirt that has the Greek letter as one of the three letters on the fraternity or sorority. And I say, oh, so that means 3.14. They, oh, no, this refers to my my sorority. So even something as apparently one-to-one relationship as the Greek letter pi or P, it doesn't just refer to 3.14. And even in the world of science, it doesn't, because in the area of chemistry, there's what's called a pi bond. And they indicate it by the Greek letter P. And it doesn't mean 3.14. So even in the scientific world, something that most people assume has a one-to-one relationship, it doesn't. Now, poets know that, and they're toward the other end of the spectrum, and they know there's a one-to-many, or as Wheelwright used the term, I like it, there are many ligatures between this symbol and what it refers to in the world. A lot of ligatures, a lot of connections. And that's the way religious language functions. So if scientific language functions toward one end of the spectrum, religious language functions toward the other end of the spectrum. I mean, after all, how can you describe something infinite and finite words? It's got to be, you know, you start using metaphors to trying to evoke something. And notice evoke is a very similar word to woo. So these words that we use attempting to describe the infinite world of God, they're trying to evoke within us a glimmer of something that's beyond capturing in one finite word. But the words that we use are words which are as multivalent as possible. So it speaks with as many voices as possible. Now, what's happened over the years, unfortunately, and this is where the English teacher will come into play, we have so become used to reading scientific language or language that seeks to move in that direction that we can no longer read well language that deliberately moves in the other direction. We can't handle poetry today. We can't handle the mytho-poetic language that is such a prevalent part of the Bible. We then try to read it like scientific language, trying to force it to a one-to-one meaning. And there's no better book of the Bible to show this than the book of Revelation, which I'm sure we'll talk about later as a good example of what process hermeneutic is trying to get around. But to sum it up, if today in our society, we read all language, or tend to anyway, as trying toward a one-to-one meaning, then we really don't know how to read language that is deliberately trying to be one to many. And therefore, when we do spot it in the Bible and we can't get away from it, for example, when Isaiah says, "The hills sing for joy and the trees clap their hands." Well, almost every ardent fundamentalist will say that's poetic. That's not literal. But they usually add the word, it's just metaphorical. It would have been better said in some sort of discursive language that's descriptive in this one-to-one approach. And so that, I think, is what process thought has helped me see the most, is that we need to learn to read other forms of language, language that engages the imagination. Because interpretation is not just a science, and there are certain scientific aspects we need to learn about language when we're interpreting the Bible. For example, it's helpful if we read Greek and Hebrew, but if not, we try to get the best English language. And then we try to learn some basic techniques like form tradition, or redaction tradition, textual criticism, and so there are some scientific approaches. But scientific approaches don't exhaust what we need to be able to do. We need to engage the imagination, because the imagination is where we can get into this what might be, which can be far more important than anything that descriptively is.
In a sense, your doctrine of God steps away from things like omnipotent, infinite, all of these sorts of terms. Also, then necessarily would form a doctrine of revelation that was also less static. And I pulled here off of page 14 in the book, discuss why probable, you on the page 14, you gave 4 levels of certainty: impossible, improbable, possible, or probable.
Okay.
And I'm sure you're aware in that some people will feel a little bit cheated at the top end of your list, because probably the same thing you've just been discussing. You're trying to read poetic language as if it's scientific. That would certainly explain why not everybody gets the same answer, which possibly explains a lot of arguments between readers of the Bible. To summarize, because I really want us to have time to go forward and look at, Revelation as an example of, but why probable is your highest level of certainty.
Okay. I was primarily discussing that in the context of history, because in history we do move toward the more attempted, at least, one-to-one relationship. So when we're engaging in the historical study of the Bible, which is an important part of biblical study, we want to try to get down to that as close as we can to a one-to-one, knowing that we never can achieve it. So when we're doing historical studies or historical criticism, we can rule certain things out. For example, we know that the Bible is not talking about television, because we know when television was invented, and it was far later than the biblical period. So impossible is something we can determine historically. And then as you move up the staircase there, you've got improbable, and then possible, possible, and then probable. The reason we can't ever get to certain when we're doing historical criticism of the Bible, well, I guess we could, but we first have to build a time machine. We're reconstructing the past. And no matter how diligent a historian is, it's still a reconstruction. There's still going to be aspects of it that are missing. So even if the probability is very, very high, maybe even up into the 90s, I'm 90 something percent this happened, 90% probability, I never can reach certainty, because it's just not something that's feasible in the realm of reconstructing the past without a time machine where we could go back and actually see it for ourselves. So the reconstruction of the past always involves an element of loss. So we can't be 100% certain. I know some people demand certainty, and the way they usually get to it is by their understanding of the doctrine of inspiration. So probably we should camp out just a little bit about two different theories of the doctrine of inspiration. All Christians believe that the Bible is inspired, but what they mean by that can be radically different. Some believe that God basically dictated the Bible verbatim, almost like God sat down at a typewriter, the author is the typewriter, and God punched the keys, and what came out was what God directly intended. I refer to that as the mechanical theory of inspiration. And there are a number of Christian groups who have a mechanical theory of inspiration, and that's how they would say, no, we can get to certainty because this is literally God's word, and therefore you can achieve certainty. Because if it said that's the way it happened, that's the way it happened. But then as you move away from that, you develop what I would refer to as a dynamic theory of inspiration. Yes, God has revealed something to the authors of the Bible, but God has had to reveal that in terms of their language, in terms of their culture, and their point in history. And then they become a filter, so to speak, so that what comes out on the other side is a divine human creation. And therefore, we don't talk in terms of certainty because, well, for example, if a person reads Greek, they can read something written by Paul and compare it to the author of Luke Acts, and you can tell it's two different people. Very different use of grammar, very different use of style, very different vocabulary. You know, the author very much enters into the creation of the biblical document. So if you have a more dynamic theory of inspiration, then it makes sense that a historian would never seek for certainty, but for the highest degree of probability that could be attained. So I don't find it at all disturbing that we can't get back to 100% certainty, because I understand the doctrine of inspiration in this more dynamic sense. And actually, I think if you read the first 3 verses of the Gospel of Luke, where Luke sets out what he's about to do, you see that that was Luke's understanding of what he was doing. So the Gospel of Luke, I believe, illustrates a doctrine of or a theory of dynamic inspiration.
I think we'll move straight to the example of Revelation. In the modern world, and as a matter of fact, this comes right from my own experience where I'd see evangelists of my denomination come through town every year. And even as a young person, I realized that, well, they were each saying, this is absolutely what the Bible tells us is going to happen shortly. I realized that it had changed from what was absolutely going to happen a year ago. I lived through watching them incorporate the Soviet Union into their interpretations, and then you see the Soviet Union disappear again from the end of time. And I say that as a background to illustrate this. We have a lot of people right now interpreting events such as resulting from the pandemic, resulting from government actions relating to that. Is everybody going to have the mark of the beast in the form of a computer chip? Or, you have, there's a great variety of, shall we say, absolute truths of what Revelation is telling us in this time. So can you apply this static language versus language as a lure to reading a book like Revelation? Revelation's usually considered apocalyptic literature, and generally reading apocalyptic results in probably some of the greatest variety of interpretations. So I think it's probably a good kind of literature in which to illustrate what you've been talking about.
I think it is. And when I started into it, I didn't really think about how that was going to affect it from that perspective. You know, it's a different understanding of language. I was actually challenged to do it. uh, the way that came about is kind of interesting too. There were a group of us that were at a Society of Biblical, I think it was Chicago. But anyway, a group of us who were process oriented, we were developing this process hermeneutic that we're talking about. And we had some people come in who were not necessarily process oriented, seek to evaluate what we were doing. And one of the speakers that we had brought in was John Collins, you know, the preeminent Old Testament scholar. And he said, well, you're doing some really interesting things here. He said, but you keep applying it to very easy texts that fit the process worldview very easily. He says, why don't you do something hard? He says, what? Something like, oh, I don't know, the apocalypse. And so at that moment, I said, okay, that's my challenge. So since that point, I've done so much with the book of Revelation, largely, well, I've always been interested in it, but I always relegated it to the future. But when he challenged us to take a book that he didn't think fit the process mold at all, that was a good challenge for me, especially when I remembered that Whitehead himself, who was just basing this upon the normal way the book of Revelation was read, he viewed it as showing a God that is coercive and using brute force. So I thought, wow, this is going to be a really good challenge. But actually, it came to be maybe one of the preeminent examples of how you can show this notion of language stimulating the imagination to imagine what might be and what could be. So to use my favorite example from it, you gave a perfect idea of the people who come to town each year, every other year, and set up shop and show you what the symbols in Revelation, you know, who they're pointing to in history, who they're pointing to now, and what's getting ready to happen next year. That's very much reading the Bible, trying to come up with a one-to-one relationship between a symbol and what it refers to. So that's that descriptive approach, trying to move toward the scientific end of the spectrum. So whatever the symbol is, it has a one-to-one meaning, and therefore it's very clear cut. We use three symbols from the book of Revelation. And one of them is the earth beast, who plays a pretty big role. A little later on, you see the sea beast. I'm sorry, reverse, sea beast first, and then the earth beast. And then you have the great whore or the great prostitute, the Babylon, you know, mother of prostitutes. So those three things. What they try to do is find out who it is in history or what specific event in history is the sea beast, the earth beast, and this woman at the end. And then they'll tell you who they are, and then you know what's going to happen, and you can read some of this has happened in the newspaper, and we're going to see the next in the next couple of years, and then the end's going to come. What if we read that evocatively? Excuse me. And I would say that is the way the early church read this before Christianity began to be spread to cultures that were not familiar with reading apocalyptic literature. Now, in the Jewish culture, apocalyptic was a well-known genre of literature before the book of Revelation was written. In fact, in it alludes to other previous Jewish apocalypses in the book of Revelation. There are these nice, not quotations, but allusions to. So they knew how to read apocalyptic literature, but it didn't take too long for the church to lose the ability to read it as it spread out to other cultures and other languages. Well, that's what's happened today. We've lost the ability to read apocalyptic, so we look for the one-to-one relationship. Who is the beast? Was it Stalin? Was it Hitler? And people, as time moves along and that person dies and falls into history, like you said, oh, well, no, we missed that. It's actually this person. Maybe it's Putin, or maybe it's Donald Trump, or maybe it's, whichever side you're coming at things from, you find who that person is, and then you hang on to that and wait for the event to come. What if that's not the way the original people would have read this? What if they read it as, here's the big word, mythopoetic language? What if that's what apocalyptic language is? It's mythopoetic language. That is, each symbol evokes a one-to-many, so that maybe they weren't wrong in seeing Hitler as embodying characteristics of the beast, but to identify him with the beast would be missing the point. So if you look at it as mythopoetic language, and I should probably break that word down. Poetic, we're familiar with that. The mytho part comes from the Greek word mythos. And unfortunately, the word myth has become a negative term. We today define myth as something that is not true, or scientists will use it as a unscientific understanding of something. I remember when AIDS was first starting up on campus, there was a group doing a good work, but I didn't like the title of the pamphlet they were passing out. They were passing out a pamphlet that said myths about AIDS. Like you can't catch AIDS from hugging somebody. And all that's good. This information needed to be disseminated, but as a religious studies scholar, it really irked me that they called these myths. No. Myths are not falsehoods. They're not unscientific. The word mythos in Greek, it literally means narrative or story. And these are the stories that make sense of our lives. In other words, a myth or a mythos is a big story that makes sense of the little stories of our lives. We find our meaning within the context of a bigger umbrella story. And mythos or myths are these big stories. So what the book of Revelation is doing is painting a cosmic story. I mean, it embraces everything, beginning to the end, Alpha and Omega, all these big symbols. John, the apocalyptic writer, is painting a mythological story, not false story, a story of meaning, a narrative. And he's trying to make sense of the world in which we live within this cosmic story. And within this cosmic story are these three characters: the earth beast, the sea beast, and the great whore. Okay, the earth beast, the sea beast comes from afar. It's across the sea. And this was John's symbol of government gone awry. And that's exactly how the people toward the end of the first century were beginning to experience the Roman Empire. They were beginning to experience the tension. Now, it wasn't the persecution that later came on, it was just the beginning of it, because even in those first 7 letters, there's only one person who's called a martyr. But clearly they're expecting there to be more. John sees on the horizon the fact that the government is going to become oppressive to this Jesus movement. The second event or person or symbol is the earth beast. Earth beast is here, not across the sea, but here. This was the commune Asia, that the people in Asia Minor of his day that started using religion as a form of their government. That is, they promoted the worship of the emperor in the provinces there in Asia Minor. And then the third symbol, the great whore, the Babylon, the person. This is using economics incorrectly to pervert God's way of doing things. Now, in John's time, that was clear that the Roman government was becoming coercive toward the church, that a local group was starting to promote the worship of the emperor in those churches of Asia Minor, and there was always the seductive lure of economics. Now, it's easy to spot those three things in John's day. And what I would suggest is that did not exhaust the meaning. It was not a one-to-one relationship. Some people read Revelation in that one-to-one and relate it to the past. It happened and it's done. I would say mythopoetic language is an ongoing thing. So we need to constantly be on the lookout for when government oversteps its boundaries, when religion begins to be used in service of religion, of the government, rather than God, and when the power of economics, the love of money, begins to corrupt the religion as well. So these three things are ongoing, and we do see them occurring. And I think that's precisely why, when you study, as you've done, historically, the ways this one-to-one relationship has been applied to the book of Revelation, and the next year they come around, they've changed what that symbol refers to and all. That's because as we've moved on, we've found new instances of events in our world that reflect certain symbols that we see in Revelation that are cosmic in scope, but not confined to any one particular instance of it in our world.
Okay, I think that does illustrate it very well. In some sense, the very thing that one might complain about, the change of the interpretation, is actually not a bad thing, provided that you don't in turn decide that the latest change is the new static one and only meaning.
Right.
I want to thank you for your time on this. The book that we're talking about is Process Theology in the Bible by Dr. Ron Farmer. We'll have some information here at the end of the video on how you can get a hold of the book that discusses these issues in a bit more detail and lays out the material we've been talking about. Again, thanks for being with us, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Henry.